Greetings everyone and welcome in today's webinar on building practical risk application into your QMS. Great to have you all here with us. I am Shaun Mehmeti, the Portfolio Marketing Manager for Quality Management System here at PCB. This webinar will be presented by Walt Murray, President and CEO of the ARC Express. It's representing quality and compliance consulting service team for Master Control. Walt is a global recognized compliance and risk consultant for quality management with more than 32 years of experience working with international recognized, highly regulated companies including Aventis, Merck, etc. Walt has performed more than 400 first, second, and third party audits. Please feel free to write your questions and comments in the question box in the right-hand control panel, or you can use the raised hand function to have a chance to ask the question directly to Walt. Left questions will be answered accordingly at the end of the presentation. Please, Walt, you may continue with the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. And good morning, everyone. This morning we will be presenting the application of risk around the ISO 9001-2015 high-level system standard. Talk a little bit about its impacts on other standards, but more importantly, the focus on the nature of risk within this standard. So, you know, how big a deal is this relative to the change from the 2008 to the 2015 is, in my mind, is significant. A lot of people are saying, I just have to rewrite my system to conform, but I already have what's in there is needed, and I'll just basically, if I need to renumber or just do the administration to the system, I'll be fine, which is absolutely not the case. There's a lot of changes, a lot of significant issues relative to this system, but the pinnacle of it and the most important one is the addition of explicit conditions for risk. So, of course, the thing unchanged is the establishment of a systematic approach. I think right now, by virtue of the way the system is laid out relative to the table of contents and the context of the standard, it is even now more systematic in its approach with the risk addition, either directly by the word risk or indirectly by other contextual words used, such as consequences, and opportunities, and so forth, are included for the purpose of having the standard become much more proactive in its risk-based approach, and that the preventive action condition is now absorbed by the nature of how risk creates both prevention but also mitigation, and of course on the opportunity side, facilitative versus exploitive actions. So the new language, of course, is risk-based thinking. It just stops short of actually saying, you know, risk management is what we're talking about here. For some organizations, depending upon the regulatory environment, risk management is a stipulation for compliance reasons. For others, it is just basically a need from a business standpoint to not put any vulnerability for your product or your organization relative to handling risk. Now, the strongest point that I wanted to speak to is the new explicit line item in the standard that says, "Thou shalt address risks and opportunity analysis." So not only is there the need specifically for addressing those risks and the context of those risks, such as acceptable, unacceptable, unforeseen, etc. All types of risks now need to be looked at in the organization by the nature of the scenario or circumstances, but also needs to be evaluated those opportunities associated with those situations as well. So, you know, first of all, let's understand this risk-based thinking approach. Risk-based thinking is something that we really do intuitively in the sense that we're automatic in looking at what should I, questions we ask ourselves are, what should I worry about? What do I need to be concerned about? Where do I need to be looking for the opportunity for failure? These are the type of thoughts that we have implicitly relative to our intuitive sense as we go through this thinking. Now, the risk-based thinking for 9001, of course, builds into the system from front to back the whole management system relative to risk-based thinking. And that's what we mean by that. And I think what's important is there isn't this grandiose management consideration that's a document that's about 3 inches wide and sits on your shelf, but rather is a very practical oriented approach across the organization. And so the idea is that it is a process approach at a systematic level where you're not only looking at issues for practical purposes related to risk, but also procedural conditions relative to risk and systematic issues relative to risk. So the approach is vertical all the way from the top to the bottom. If you're like me and you're an engineer, typically engineering orientation or risk-based thinking goes like this, okay, which is if I'm smart enough and I'm good enough and I do things the right way, there won't be any risks. So I can sit in my pool and drink beer all day, not have to worry about 220 volts coming anywhere near me based on how I've engineered out the risk. Now, the engineering factor relative to risk is critical and important, but as you can see here, basically it goes beyond that and understanding circumstances, which this does not, relative to really being aware of a risk-based approach. Okay? So risk-based thinking has some significant benefits to it. Probably the most important one is the prioritization of resources and the merit as to why that prioritized research prioritized approach is being used, both in the form of preparation relative to analysis, but also in terms of inspection, and also prioritization as it relates to other processes in the organization, such as your CAPA log and the conditions of initiation and the project management of CAPAs and prioritization based on risk as an example, as a practical example of the level of the use of risk. A simple risk analysis. Improving customer rapport. So dealing with the nature of complaints, escalating efficiently those serious issues that pose a severity or a probability condition, and proper channeling those types of complaints related to risk. Consistency in the product and services, of course, the most important impact there is that you have an internal profit factor relative to looking at risks related to the efficiency of operation and product. And I'm going to use a very specific example to make that point later in the presentation. We want objective evaluation. So this objectiveness issue is really from a organizational responsibility relative to this standard and risk is its ability to be used in understanding the establishment of various procedures and the conditions associated with those procedures. For instance, in this case, supplier selection, which is now a process where the first step in that process is the sourcing condition, which in loose terms is really the design factor for selection of suppliers. So there is a risk condition in the sourcing phase relative to understanding the nature of why you're choosing a supplier and what the criteria are for that in order to reduce risk. And of course, moving away from a reactive condition, moving into a proactive condition for preventive action versus corrective action, or now risk and opportunity analysis versus corrective action. So in terms of the requirements, of course, risk and opportunities in the organization will depend on its context, but is a requirement as well as the context to the certification of the system, but more importantly, the sound use of the process approach on this basis. So if you note, though, that the standard does not require you to carry out a full formal risk assessment, the important part is that much like in software where you have requirements for software, validation is the condition under which you show that those items have been covered and are actively doing the things they should. The same concept here with regard to the management system. And of course this is an HLS or high-level systems approach, which means that this standard can cover across multiple industries, multiple sectors, multiple environments with high to low regulatory compliance conditions and so forth. So in that context, there is a standard, the ISO 31000, that is risk management in principles and guidelines relative to risk. And it's a very useful reference, but it's not mandated. The companion document to that, which is mandated under the medical device standard, is the ISO 14971, which is risk management for product. So we're talking about uniqueness relative to product from the design all the way through to the manufacture of that product. And the ISO 14971 is the standard of use within that standard of compliance. So the key concepts here, of course, is analyze and prioritize using risk and opportunity analysis. What is acceptable? What is unacceptable? This is a very important management factor relative to the association of understanding risk. This acceptability issue is not just for product, but for processes, for materials, for equipment and test methods under validation circumstances, etc. Plan actions to address the risks. How can I avoid or eliminate it? How can I mitigate the consequence if it should occur? So implement the plan, and again here in taking actions, even the plan comes under the scrutiny of risk. Plan analysis is a process for looking at critical areas relative to problems and opportunities. I'm going to show you an example of that in just a moment. And of course the VOE, or verification of effectiveness and checking effectiveness, is important in this process. So let's talk about risk and opportunities. So where is risk management, or where's risk specifically mentioned in this standard? Well, there in the predecessory documents under section 01, 3, 5, and 6, the concept is set up very specific. So for instance, in the general comments, the risks associated with its context and objectives. So risk not only should be evaluated as a result of the objectives relative to criteria, but also in the objective itself, the context of risk relative to the organization. From a process approach, with an overall focus on risk-based thinking. So we're talking about peppering the risk-based thinking at a practical approach level all the way through the context of the elements of the standard. Risk-based thinking as a definition. The effect of uncertainty or an unexpected result, an expected result, and the concept of risk-based thinking has always been implicit, now is explicit. And of course, in the compatibility with other systems, processes for planning and consideration of risk and opportunities. Where is it mentioned relative to terms and definitions? Risk, effective in the definitionary section, the effect of uncertainty on an expected result. In the section for the context of the company or the organization, this should be analyzed in accordance with the requirements and plan and implementation of appropriate actions to address them. So risk is now the factor for the commensurate condition of implementation and planning with regard to risk. Customer focus under leadership. Risk and opportunities can affect conformity and services and the ability to enhance customer satisfaction and are determined and addressed. So this reinforces the explicit nature of risk and opportunity analysis. Under the planning for quality management, of course, we have the specific line item relative to the standard where we're actually talking about the performance of actions to address risks and opportunities. So when planning the system, the organization shall consider the issues referred to in 4.1 and the requirements referred to in 4.2 and determine or use a process for the determination of risks and opportunities and their need to be addressed. Post-delivery activities, risks associated with the products and services. In management review, now we have very explicitly the effectiveness of actions taken to address risks and opportunities as they arise through analysis and evaluation. In the appendix of the standard, we're talking about A4 definition for a risk-based approach. Although risk and opportunities have been to be determined and addressed, is no requirement for formal risk management or a documented risk management process. So another way of saying that is, do you have the ability to show objective evidence that in those areas relative to process that the appropriate level of risk analysis or risk controls are in place so that your system can operate with less or no vulnerability on the basis of that process or system. In terms of understanding relative to organizational knowledge, it's very specific here, and it says knowledge needs to take account of the organization's context, including size and complexity, and now the risks and opportunities it needs to address. And specifically for the external condition relative to suppliers, contractors, and even external parties such as regulators, local codes, etc., it's important to take a risk-based approach for the determination of the type and extent of those controls appropriate to those providers and externally provided products and or services. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about tools in the context of the standard. Okay. Standard does not prescribe a methodology or require a documented process for risk-based thinking. Ultimately, the organization chooses the suitable process and methodologies to go along with it in order to address risk. So choose wisely. And as an example, in the companion guideline standard or document for ISO 31000 is the ISO 31010. And in the 31010 is a host of opportunities for different methods for analysis. It should be justified and appropriate to the situation under the consideration of the context of that organization. It should provide results in a form which enhances understanding relative to the nature of risk or the nature of situations for which risk will come about and how they can be treated. It should be capable of use in a manner, we're talking about the tools here, to provide some traceability, repeatable, and verifiable information. Considerations, of course, would be such things as objectives of a study, where you're looking at metrics, the needs of the decision makers, where you're looking at criteria, the type and range of risks being analyzed on the basis of the definition of those, the definition of those risks, the potential magnitude of the consequences. So now it's not just a matter of if we need to mitigate or do containment, but actually looking at providing a quantitative magnitude factor relative to the nature of the consequence. And of course the degree of expertise or other resources needed to deal with that risk or risks. The availability of data, and we're talking about information or data in an empirical sense, not in a experiential sense. The need for modification, dating of or traceability relative to assessments provided, and of course this is in order for us to show a breadcrumb trail for improvement purposes, which is the nature of the standard. And of course, are there any regulatory or contractual agreements by which risk needs to be evaluated, contained, or eliminated? Now, you may not see these very well, but this is just to give you a quick look at the host of opportunities for the different types of risk analysis methodologies, and these are actually right in the front of the appendix of the 31010 document where they're located. One of those, of course, is brainstorming, and of course, as we know, brainstorming is the stimulation of a free-flowing discussion where a group of people in the knowledge identify such things as failure modes or potential failure modes, and of course specifically the hazards, risks, and or criteria for decisions related to choosing an alternative action where there may be risks involved. Okay. The term brainstorming, though, is often very loosely defined and meant for just general rumination, if you would, of the group. However, true brainstorming involves particular techniques that ensure the imagination is triggered by thoughts and statements of the group in the process, as well as other groups or persons who contribute. So my point is that there's a formality here relative to this process. The brainstorming condition can be captured under a fishbone diagram where you're looking at multiple singular or multiple factor or factors associated with each other within the context of the channels in which they come, such as methods, materials, manpower, machines, etc. The other one is the structured interview, which is basically individuals and those interviews or interviewees asked to go through a set of prepared questions, and that there's a prompting sheet or what we would refer to as a checklist, and the view to view a situation from a different perspective and thus identify risks from that perspective. So a semi-structured interview is similar, but allows more freedom for the conversation to explore issues which arise. Now, this is a very important slide, probably the pinnacle slide for me today relative to this material we're covering, and that is that no longer from an audit perspective are we looking at understanding that we have a process, it has activities, and through the designation of a box or a document designator or a decision diamond or whatever in terms of the process flow, the key is not the activity itself. Now, it's important to know the nature of the activity and in the context of it, but where the greatest risks occur are in the white space, in the arrows between those activities, where there is latitude for decision-making, latitude for situation evaluation, latitude for suggesting nonconformance conditions are or are not relative and germane to the condition of the product or the service. I mean, these things are important, and they need to be looked at as opportunities in that white space for using risk management or a risk-based process. So the key here that creates risk are these bullets, some of these bullets I have above, such as the lack of criteria around planned execution, not having or having poor critical thinking skills in the 5 critical thinking aspects of an organization, any organization. The 5 do not change. And then, of course, allowances for fudging on aspects and impacts between activities, or simply not knowing the level of risk related to those activities and being aware of those risks. So as the organizational flow changes, so does the white space in consideration. So this is where focus should occur systematically within the organization is between process conditions, within processes themselves, whether it's a supplier process, a non-conformance process, a design process, or a CAPA process, or any process relative to the system, a manufacturing process. Now, I bring an example that's important to understand the practicality of what we're dealing with inside a system. As you all know, one of the stipulations is an internal audit needs to be performed as a stipulative condition of the system and in order for the system to operate in total. As a matter of fact, if you look in the list on the left-hand side, you'll find internal audits 822 or 8.2.2 which that number has changed now in the context of the new standard. But the importance I want to play out here in terms of this slide is this. There is a functional side to the business, which is the top columns. There is a systematic approach relative to the processes within the system on the rows on the left. And providing definition to risk-based criteria, in the case of green being maybe a ladder audit or maybe a 2-year, maybe put off as an audit in a cycle of a 2-year cycle versus a 1-year cycle, and of course yellow is the ALARP or need to improve condition by understanding components either from previous audits or from conditions of customer complaints or whatever the assemblage of information is that puts those criteria at risk. And of course the red areas being those that absolutely must be covered by the audit, must have a unique understanding of accentuating the conditions of those items within the audit and particular requirements or expectations relative to the red with regard to the system. So here's a risk-based scheduling approach used by definitionary criteria, and then an organization can then go about validating the system in a risk commensurate way. Okay? Now, this has significant latitude relative to the definitions, with the exception, of course, of those shalls that are required on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side may be specific items that would be looked at or may be considered relative to any one of the elements, and there's no set requirements for how much or the nature of those comments. And of course, the reasoning behind that is understanding, the paths to escalation of an event, ultimately to a CAPA. So we all have events that occur in our organization, and those events typically come in through some channel, whether it's an engineering nonconformance, an audit nonconformance, a supplier nonconformance, a customer nonconformance, whatever that may be. And we need to have the ability to look at these sliding scales to understand exactly where that event, okay, it falls. So if the top one, for instance, is the severity and the bottom one is the probability, where am I in the sliding scale? Am I a red relative to severity and a yellow relative to probability? That's going to get much more prioritization in terms of focus than one that may be a yellow in terms of severity and green in terms of probability. So it's important to understand there's an escalation risk-based factor that should be associated with any events in your organization, from do I watch it, do I correct it, or do I escalate to a CAPA for corrective action based on an investigation. But here's an example of a document, and in looking at this document, basically the flow of this is a risk and opportunity analysis worksheet. So we go from either steps or it can be an engineering drawing for conditions of that drawing, whatever it may be. We have a multiplier that for each one of these items that immediately becomes a factor in prioritization relative to this sheet for critical areas. And that's simply probability and impact. It gives us the number, the Q number for the actual level, very much like an RPN would be used in a FMEA. More importantly is the fact that you're generating causes for the situation and basically doing a informal cause analysis. And then the key to this, of course, is those actions taken either as a preventive action for control and elimination of the cause, or mitigation in terms of containment relative to the consequence from the cause. And of course, the alarms is a detection factor. It's important to realize that there's also an opportunity side to this. So if you have a potential opportunity, the action modes change. So preventive actions now become facilitative, and containment actions now become exploitive relative to Murphy's Law. So I'm going to kind of wrap this up with an example that you may all have been aware of historically, which was the volcano eruption in Iceland some time back. And that the disruption, interestingly, if any of you fly between the United States and Europe, the crisscross pattern relative to flights is a semi-concave arc of travel that goes up along the east coast through Newfoundland, across to southern Greenland, to Iceland, and then down into the British Isles, and then into the mainland of Europe. So the tracking and travel conditions of thousands of flights is across that pattern. Well, the volcano, of course, for Iceland is right in that pattern, because Iceland's not a very big, in size relative to other countries. It's very specific. And so, we need to recognize and we need to go there when we're looking at uncertainty and the effect of that uncertainty in order to achieve objectives relative to our system. Okay. Now, this is a portrayal which is good for management to understand, from a leadership perspective, say in management review, where you are evaluating unique events in the center, or an event that becomes an incident. And then, of course, the left-hand side is the importance of causes to hazards, and in the case of even a fault tree analysis, the controls that come about as a risk assessment versus that risk assessment giving us a Murphy's Law condition for reactive controls to consequences relative to outcomes on the right-hand side. And, of course, this is referred to as a bow tree analysis. Okay, so where are we? So risk is here. We need to get used to it. As opposed to the 3 times mentioned in the 2008 revision, risk is mentioned approximately 43 times in this revision. So, it's multifold. Risk-based thinking is now everywhere, whether it be escalation of a kappa, whether it be the nature of containment or correction relative to nonconformance, or whether it be a management review decision based on resource commitments for, say, training relative to risks within a unique circumstance that has high risk. Of course, use the correct tool for the job, and if nothing else, don't run electricity through your pool. So now we'll just turn the time over briefly to back to PECB and let them explain the slide to you for their services, and then we'll entertain some questions.
Yes, thank you, Walt, for this great presentation and explanation about the risk into the QMS. Now, we want to inform you that PECB provides training and certification service for ISO 9001-2015, Introduction, Foundation, Lead Implementer, and Lead Auditor. Training is designed to help you develop a single management system or quality management system by maximizing your benefits and fulfilling your customers' wants and needs. Also ensures that you meet your desired level of quality, and the most importantly, you will be recognized worldwide. The exam and certification fees are included in the training price, and also participants' certificate of CPDs will be issued to participants. For more information, please visit our website PECB/training. Oh, okay, now with the time left, we'll go ahead with some questions. Therefore, if you have any question, it's time to ask them. Okay, Mr. Murray, here is the first question. What is your what is your recommended methodology for easier adaptation?
For, I'm sorry, what was that? For what?
What is your recommended methodology for easier
Yes.
adaptation?
For easier adaptation.
Yeah, that's
I think first is the relationship of understanding relative to the order of magnitude of risk that a company needs to deploy. So it's one thing to say you're going to do this. It's another thing for your team to understand the nature and level of vulnerability, and then that should drive what people should have competency around this. So competency is absolutely imperative for adaptation. And then secondly is to start off with, as a result of meeting your objectives, with some basic opportunities for risk analysis and understanding risk to be deployed. My example in this slide deck was the use of plan analysis, just taking and quantifying, prioritizing the commensurate areas that have higher risks relative to the multiplier for probability and impact. You don't even need to have those definitions there and do a qualitative condition based on the inference of experience from the team. So that's the second thing. Of course, the third thing is to make sure that you have some form of risk analysis within each process and understand where that should occur and make sense for the QMS. So in the example of a supplier control, there is a guideline out there, N17, which is a GHTF or IMDRF guideline, and in there is a very how-to understanding of the risk application in supplier control in each of the key steps that occur from sourcing to control.
Yes, okay, thank you very much. There is another question. What are the risks, challenges, and solutions for implementing risk into the quality management system or any other ISO management system?
The challenges. Well, first of all, and this is a good question because I deal with this on a consultative basis with many organizations. There is the change agent condition that probably is the most important aspect of this, which is to be able to come up with a plan that will take into account the ability for your people to accept their responsibility around adapting risk analysis, risk assessment, and then, of course, commensurate actions and activities and controls associated with that. The organization, from a business standpoint, needs to explain the area of vulnerability around any uncertainty in the organization and its impact on the business. So that's a very important thing. But I think the change management around this is probably the number one issue I deal with, and typically at the mid-level executive management team, where these people are competing every day with objectives that they need to accomplish, and where risk may simply be looked at as an afterthought. So it's important to take people from this unconscious incompetency, which is basically not having the skill or the knowledge, and making them conscious competence, meaning that they're going to try to provide structure for doing risk analysis or assessment and come up with those controls that are necessary. And that's got to be commensurate. If you have a risk that's minor and you have a qualitative way of dealing with it, fine. If you have a risk where the commensurate condition is very high in terms of severity and probability, then that area should be maintaining a more formal process approach, and that should be on the leadership with the quality organization and the regulatory organization to identify those, sell those to those parts of the company where that factor is there and needs to be covered based on prioritizing those risks.
Thank you, Walt, for this answer and explaining about the attendees' question. Okay, there is one more question. If formal risk management is not required and risk register is not mandatory, how can organization demonstrate and understand? Sorry, just a little bit because the question is confused. If formal risk management is not required and risk register is not mandatory, how can organization demonstrate and understand the risk and opportunities and are managing them effectively? Did you get the question?
Yes, okay, I did.
Thank you very much.
You know, on the side of the regulatory impacts with regard to risk, it's fairly standardized in terms of the expectation and formality around the documentation of risk. And some of that's done through the stipulation of using a particular risk standard, such as ISO 14971. On the other hand, organizations who are not bound by that regulatory effort can be effective by looking at their QMS and doing a systematic level failure mode analysis. So what you're talking about then is, instead of doing a failure mode analysis at the product level or at the process level, looking at systems in your organization and identifying critical areas. And this would be done as an exercise where you would capture that information and you can capture it in a situational or circumstantial evaluation. So basically start out with very large cloudy type concerns or indigestion, break those concerns down into very specific issues, because some of each of those issues you break this into by asking target questioning. What do you mean by where, when? Breaking these concerns into issues then can be looked at from a risk association through timing, urgency, and impact. And so you now have a grading system for prioritizing these concerns systematically. Then the next step would be to understand the critical thinking approach, which is, you know, what are my next steps? Am I doing a root cause analysis? Am I into a decision mode, or do I know what my actions are and I need to put an effective plan in place? One of those three. Most organizations create risk because they don't use the appropriate critical thinking process to move forward. So that's an aspect of this where you're creating risk simply by not using appropriate process, either casually or in a formal approach relative to a team, cross-functional team.
Yeah, thank you, Walt, for this answer. It was a very pleasure to have you as a presenter, and because we are running out of the time, we will have to conclude this presentation. However, if the attendees have any other questions, you can send your question through email, and Walt will answer to them individually. Thank you again, Walt, for this clear and informative presentation. I want to thank all the attendees as well for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us today. We hope you enjoyed the webinar. To keep up with our webinars, please check PECB's webinar schedule in our website, pecb.com, or our social media network. Next Tuesday, we are hosting a webinar on the topic, the value ISO 29001 adds to the oil and gas industry. Thank you, Walt, and goodbye.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And thank the audience.
Yeah, bye-bye.